some outcomes were downright unjust, even inhumane. The fear factor was certainly disturbing. A catalogue of unethical and inappropriate behaviour.
Deborah Glass may be stepping back, but she's certainly not holding back. Thanks for your time, Deborah.
My pleasure.
10 years is a long time. Over the last decade, do you think the government has got worse or better when it comes to things like integrity and transparency?
In the 10 years I've been in the job, I have had some 95% of my recommendations accepted and for the most part implemented, and I think that's a good thing. Among the 5% that weren't accepted, I think were some of the more important recommendations I made in my term, and that there have been some disappointments there.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
During an era of Labor dominance, Victoria's first female Ombudsman was very active, releasing nearly 100 reports, holding the government, councils and public sector to account. Her office uncovered election rorts and the misuse of taxpayer money, branch stacking, and exposed a culture of fear in the public service, with staff afraid they'd be sacked if they spoke out.
I think one of the things I found most disappointing is what we began to see increasingly is, what you might call a lack of respect being paid to the findings of integrity agencies and attempts to dismiss that. I think that's a bad look for government.
Do you think the former Premier Daniel Andrews respected you in your office?
I think that's a question for him, but some of the things he's said in his last year and since wouldn't suggest that.
It's no secret the Ombudsman and the former Premier weren't friendly. In the 9 years since Daniel Andrews was elected, the pair have used public press conferences to exchange barbs, but have never had a face-to-face discussion.
We're grateful for that educational report and those 17 findings.
It was not an educational report. It was a damning report about misconduct.
There's been apparent tension between yourself and Daniel Andrews. Do you think it became personal?
Well, considering I never met him while he was Premier, it's hard to describe it as personal. But it did feel like that sometimes. It was noticeable when he was asked questions about one of my reports that he would seem to bristle. And I got the impression that I got under his skin.
Those claims, that rhetoric, that commentary has no basis in fact whatsoever.
Do you think a change in Premier is enough to create real change?
It's not about a change in Premier, it's a change in attitude. I mean, it's, leadership starts at the top.
Deborah Glass says her biggest disappointment was the refusal of the Andrews government to apologise to the 3,000 Victorians it locked down in 9 public housing towers without warning during the pandemic.
It may feel symbolic, an apology. What difference does an apology make? But it's symbolism has its place.
The government's taken the advice before, apologising to Puffing Billy abuse victims in 2019.
We know that these things can happen. So when they don't happen, you have to ask yourself, why? Why was it so difficult for the government to acknowledge that it got something wrong?
And do you know why that would be?
Well, if you look at the 2 apologies, one related to something that happened before the government was in office and the other didn't.
And what do you think that suggests?
I don't think I need to join the dots for you there, Bridget. I think what we have seen is something of a constitutional reluctance to admit when things go wrong, and that's unfortunate because a government that really cared about integrity and accountability would take notice when the Ombudsman says something.
And right now, she's saying the government needs to be braver when it comes to justice reform and not be driven by headlines and knee-jerk reactions. Are you worried about justice reform under this current government?
I've been worried about it for the last 10 years, and that started with the previous Liberal government. So I don't think this is something that that any political party has particularly covered itself in glory in.
Deborah Glass probed the prison system extensively, but says it was the issue that gained the least traction. Last year, Victorian taxpayers spent $1.5 billion to keep people locked up in prison.
Now, you could take a fraction of that money and invest it earlier on into preventing the crime. How much better would we be? But you can't do that in 4 years.
So what needs to change?
Some vision would be a good start. A government that cared about real justice reform, that was prepared to invest in that and make some tough decisions about how these things could happen. We know that Victoria has been a leader in justice reform, and we could be one again, but there's no appetite at all that I've seen in the 10 years I've been in the role to make that happen.
But vision and reform will mean little to disengaged voters who may not know or even care about the Ombudsman's findings.
You recently said that you've done all that you can do now and it's up to voters to decide. Do you think voters are listening to you?
I really don't know. When it comes to integrity, it's a really important question as to how much people care about it. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try and communicate this in ways that should make people care. So, let's talk about what it costs us to not have integrity. Let's look at what we saw with the suburban rail loop and the Commonwealth Games. The lack of due diligence before entering into commitments. And some of these are integrity issues. And integrity issues, if these things, if left unchecked, will cost us a great deal of money, and we've already seen that.
And what's next for you, Deborah?
I think if you do your job well, and I hope I have, that you're not likely to be offered another job, at least not anywhere associated with government, and that's fine. That's the right thing. So you've got to be prepared to spend more time in the garden.